Welcome to CFRI's Cystic Fibrosis Community Voices, a video podcast series created by and for the cystic fibrosis community.
Hello and welcome. I'm Siri Bates, CFRI's Executive Director, and it's my honor to welcome you all to this next Q&A on COVID-19 and cystic fibrosis with Dr. Rick Moss. The information about COVID-19 is changing so rapidly, so I do want to note that what you're hearing today is information that was current on September 10th. Also, I want to remind people that what you hear today should not be used for any changes in your medical care or regimen, and if you are pondering making changes, please consult with your CF team. And also, I forgot to say this, but I will say it now, that we are recording this from our respective homes in Northern California, where there are many wildfires, horrible air quality, and we don't know if that's interrupting our connections, but it might get choppy from time to time in this recording, and if so, please bear with us. We will continue through it. And now on to welcoming Dr. Moss. We are so grateful to Dr. Moss for sharing your time and your expertise with the CF community to answer our questions and address our concerns about COVID-19 and CF. Dr. Moss has made many contributions to the international field of CF in the areas of research and clinical care. And he's a former director of the Stanford CF Center and professor emeritus of pediatric medicine at Stanford, where he continues to conduct clinical research. I have to add, we are very honored that he is also a member of CFRI's board of directors. So thank you so much, Dr. Moss, and welcome.
Hello again. Hi.
So we'll start with, there are certain questions we've asked every podcast, and of course, starting from the top, what is the current state now of COVID-19 cases in the United States and globally, both cases and numbers of people who have passed away?
Well, it continues to evolve in terms of where the hotspots are globally. Latest reports have 28 million cases around the world with over 900,000 deaths. In the United States, we remain the number one hotspot in the world with the most cases and the most deaths. We have 6.5 million cases in the United States now and closing in on 196,000 deaths. Some projections have us at 400,000 deaths by the end of the year. I hope that's not true, but that's a late projection from a pretty reputable group up at the University of Washington.
It is absolutely stunning, and to think, as I mentioned, we had started this in March, and at that time, I remember one of the first podcasts, and there were 4,000 cases. It's just hard to wrap our brains around how quickly this is escalating. So we are curious, what can you share regarding reports of COVID-19 in the CF community? How many cases have there been, and how are people faring?
Yeah, the weekly report from the CF Foundation, which came in today, so it's very much up to date, is interesting in that they've dropped stating the number of tests because some centers are now testing patients on a routine basis, so that it becomes a little less meaningful. As of last week, it was interesting, though, that the positivity rate in CF was 5.8%, which is a little bit above the comfort level. Most jurisdictions and areas would like to have under 5% positive tests to indicate you're doing enough testing. And that may be one reason why, routine testing is now being implemented in some clinics, which I think is a good thing. So without that number, we now have 204 cases in the United States, 64 pediatric cases, 51 hospitalizations, of which 13 are pediatric, 23 patients with what they call advanced lung disease, and I'm assuming that means FEV1 below 40%. With diagnoses. One of those patients has passed away, and 9 transplant patients with the second fatality there. So still just 2 fatalities in the U.S. Registry reported population, which is, I think, still pretty good considering everything else. In the UK, as of August 31st, they had 30 cases. The interesting thing in their data report was 40% of those CF COVID cases were asymptomatic when tested. So that is in line with what we've heard from the general sort of studies that have been done about asymptomatic cases, and one death in the UK. Then there's this project in Europe in which about 35 countries involved. 18 of these countries have reported cases, for a total of 151 in that area, primarily in Europe. Only 8 ICU cases and 3 deaths in that group. Most of those patients are in the 30 to 50 age range, and most have mild lung disease, at least in terms of FEV1 being greater than 70%. And again, as we've noted in the past, diabetes and transplants seem to be somewhat overrepresented. 35% of their cases have diabetes, and 17% of the cases in Europe are transplant recipients. So that's the general CF picture now. I think the overall takeaway from that is the CF community is doing a good job in protecting itself and keeping the case low. And the people that are getting sick are by and large doing well. They're recovering. We don't know about longer term outcomes, but at least they're getting through it without acute severe problems in most cases.
A combination of already being so well versed in hygiene and infection control practices, and also I think for us, we took it seriously from day one. There was no minimizing the risk.
Yeah, this is about the best prepared community I think that there is in terms of being able to handle, on at least a medical basis, of what's going on.
We had a question submitted. I hear that in one case, a hospital really pushed for convalescing at home and would not admit a CF patient until O2 saturation fell below a dangerous point. If this is the case, do you recommend CF patients having blood oxygen measuring equipment at home?
Well, that's a case-by-case issue, and I think depends in large part on what your baseline status is. If you already have a substantial degree of lung disease, certainly if you're using oxygen at home intermittently, or if you have moderate to severe CF lung disease, it might be a good idea to have a home oximeter. There are rankings of those. They're available on the internet for as cheap as $25 to $30. There are some caveats with it, so you need to read up on proper use of that if you're going to do it. Things like nail polish and making sure you're using the finger and keeping the hand warm. Just some tips about making sure it's reliable. But I think for people that are otherwise doing well and healthy, it's probably not necessary. Every emergency room and urgent care clinic in the country has its own approach to admission or sending people home, and whether or not they're using oximetry at all in their outpatient COVID care. So it's going to be very variable. I think you have to go more by your own condition than perhaps what that particular facility is doing.
And not CF specific, but what are the current and most effective treatments for COVID-19?
Well, that remains now in the 20% or so of people that need to get hospitalized. And in that group, there are 2 effective treatments. One are steroids. There's actually now 3 different steroid drugs that all have been shown to be effective. Dexamethasone and hydrocortisone or prednisone, those all can be helpful. So that's one group. So the steroids for the hospitalized patient who needs oxygen or is deteriorating. The other is viral, the remdesivir, which again is a hospital-based treatment at this point because it needs to be given intravenously, and it's only been studied in that setting. We have a question mark after the convalescent plasma issue because a large study showed that it seemed to have a positive effect, but that study was flawed because there was no control group, and we still don't have what's called a randomized controlled trial available of sufficient size to really make that a firm recommendation. That was the one that the head of the FDA had to walk back his language a little bit after they gave an emergency use authorization for plasma. But that's being used very frequently. That's really about it in terms of treatments that we know can be helpful. So we don't really have treatments now that are focused on early disease, people that are not in the hospital. And that's under very intensive study with literally hundreds of different clinical trials around the world, including some right in our backyard here at Stanford.
Are blood thinners given as standard protocol now, or is that based on patient? It just seems like you hear so many stories about clotting.
Yeah, that is based on some biomarkers, some evidence that clotting is going to be a problem for a particular patient. And again, there's some differences between hospitals and groups. But if there's evidence that clotting is an issue, absolutely anticoagulation would be given in that situation. And similarly, for other complications, for example, a secondary infection. So if there's evidence that there's a bacteria or a fungus which have become issues in these patients, those would get treated with antibiotics or antifungal drugs and so on for various other complications.
What do we know at this point about the spread of the virus through children? The largest world study shows the risk of children dying from COVID-19 is very rare, but a study out of Korea shows that asymptomatic children do carry the virus for up to 3 weeks and can transmit the virus.
Right. So that's a complicated picture. There's a lot to say about COVID in kids. The first is that it's not an insignificant number. In the United States, there are over 513,000 cases in children below the age of 18, which is about 10% of all of COVID cases, which is less than the proportion of kids in the population. About 22% of our population are kids. So it does happen, and it's certainly there. And that's a particular concern with everyone going back to school or trying to get back into school or college, so on. There's been an uptick in the number of cases in the United States, about a 16% increase over the last 2 weeks, so it's becoming more frequent. Luckily, kids do fare better. Less than 4% of all the hospitalizations are pediatric cases, and well under 1% of the deaths are in children. Of course, the other side of this is that there is this late syndrome of multi-system inflammation that could affect the heart in particular and the gut, which has led to several hundred cases, probably over 1,000 cases now in the States. And in terms of the issue of transmission, a recent study from Chicago showed that children can carry much higher viral load than adults. A very concerning finding. But they're not sick with it, which is this disconnect between being infected and being ill. So kids can be carriers and spread the disease because of a high viral load. That's a real concern, especially around the issue of school and other communal activities. In terms of why they're not getting sick despite the high viral load, one clue to that, which has come up, is in looking at the lining of the nose, the epithelial cells in the nose. The receptor for the virus is less detectable in children below the age of 10 than it is in adolescents or adults. And that might be one reason why they can have a lot of virus but not be sick. So the danger would be more to others than to themselves, but bottom line, they can get sick. Some can get very sick. A number can get a late illness related to COVID. That's a distinct syndrome. And they certainly are a possible source of major transmission. So all these things need to be kept in mind.
So then that goes to the next question submitted. What is your opinion on sending kids back to schools that are holding in-person classes during the pandemic? Do you believe the precaution schools are taking are safe enough to stop further spikes in COVID-19?
Well, I think there are guidelines starting from the CDC, going all the way down to the school district level, and then individual decisions by principals and superintendents. Ultimately, it comes down to the parent, where they have to make a decision about whether or not to send their child in. And so it's going to be there's not going to be one possible answer to that. It really depends on what that particular school is doing. Obviously, if they can implement physical distancing, this is somewhat age dependent, but the issue of masks can be applicable to some students and not others, so that comes into play. And of course, the whole testing situation comes into play. How frequently and how reliably is testing being done? So there's no way to give an answer without knowing the details, and those details, unfortunately, are going to be very widespread. So it's going to be up to each parent uh, to investigate what is going on in their particular school and then make their own decision based on their judgment about how safe it is. In certain situations, I think it can be done safely. It is being done safely. In others, it's just totally off the charts horrible. I mean, we saw the cases of some of these colleges where in the first week over 1,000 students, get infected, and they have to send everybody home after they've already left, relocated, gone into their dorms, had their parties, and now everyone's going back home where they can spread it around the community. So this is the sad situation of the educational problem in our country. It's really the saddest thing about it is, the lack of educational opportunity for so many children. It feeds into food insecurity for a large number of families that rely on school lunches. It's an tremendous economic burden for families that where the caretakers have to be at work. What are they going to do during the day when the kid's supposed to be getting educated? So all these things are making it one of the most intractable and difficult problems our society is facing right now.
Absolutely. And yes, for people who have no choice because they're essential workers and every paycheck is critical, there's those decisions. I just read an article about how many women are leaving their professional jobs because it's become unable to have the kids at home, and how women are more likely to do that. And so we have the imbalance growing once again in the job market. So you are correct. So, but based on the comment about the college, I would assume you agree with that, Dr. Fauci, about that it's somewhat unethical for colleges who have gathered students together to then send them all back to their communities to become super spreaders in remote communities.
Yeah, you would think that the school has some responsibility to identify their cases and at least set up a system for appropriate treatment or quarantining, depending on that. And that puts a burden of contact tracing actually within the school system, which most of them are completely unprepared and unable to do. So it's a pretty big mess.
Now we'll move on to the flu. So what do we know about the threat of COVID-19 infection during the cold and flu season?
We know nothing at this point, but we're about to find out. And this can go both ways because people are doing the physical distancing and taking other measures. We might have a very mild flu season. That's possible because of the precautions that people have been taking. On the other hand, we already know from earlier data, this comes from Stanford actually, a study that was done here, about 20% of the COVID cases that were diagnosed in March and April also were positive for flu, even back at that time. So the odds are that there'll be plenty of people that could get co-infected. And that's why it's especially important to get your flu shot, which are available earlier this year than usual. You can go and get them now. So I would recommend the entire CF community to do that as soon as possible. Like any other year, it's really not totally known how protective the flu shot will be for flu this year. Hopefully it'll be one of the good years. We don't know that. And we really don't know anything about how these viruses would interact if they both infect the same person. The assumption is things might get worse, but we don't really know that for sure. But I think that's a reasonable assumption. So it's really important to try to avoid getting the flu by maintaining the same measures we've been doing since March, but then adding in the flu shot. And if you do start to get flu-like symptoms, get tested immediately because there is an effective treatment for flu that can reduce the illness period and at least make things a little bit better that way. The Tamiflu won't do anything for COVID, but it will help if you do get the flu, if you start it within usually 48 hours of getting symptoms of flu. So and since the symptoms are the same, I think in many cases people should try and get tested for both flu and COVID if they have flu-like symptoms. To me, that seems like the reasonable approach.
And we had several people ask about the flu shot, knowing they should get it, but it seems a lot of people, myself included, somehow think, oh, I should get it a little later so it lasts through the season. But this seems like the year, get it sooner rather than later.
I wouldn't wait. I think we know that the flu vaccine response will last through a season. So getting it now should not be a problem for this season. In later years, that's a different story, but there was really no reason to delay. You might you might catch it and regret not getting it if you do delay.
Let's see. A person asked, will this year's seasonal flu shot also help to activate the immune system to protect against COVID-19?
That's a really interesting and very good question. We have more than one flu vaccine. Most people get the flu shot. The flu shot is an inactivated flu vaccine. And there's another flu vaccine which you can take by nasal spray, the flu mist nasal vaccine, which is an attenuated flu vaccine, which is relevant to this question because several other attenuated vaccines, which means a vaccine where the germ is not completely killed but weakened so that it can survive and replicate a little bit without making you sick, that produces a better immune response in those live attenuated vaccines. There's one theory called trained immunity where a vaccine like that could protect or help protect against COVID. And trials are being done now with several live attenuated vaccines. These include the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis, which is not given in the United States, but is in many places around the world to newborns. So there are trials of BCG for trained immunity in COVID. Other people have proposed using the oral polio vaccine, another live attenuated vaccine, or the measles, mumps, the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. So these are all vaccines which actually might help. And it's conceivable, although this has not been studied, that the flu mist might be in that category. I'm just putting that out there as a speculation. So whether it's worth not getting a flu shot and going for the nasal vaccine, I don't think there's any evidence to support that, but I'm just speculating that it could have that effect. So I can't give an unambiguous answer to the question about whether a flu vaccine will help you with COVID. But there is a theoretical possibility that at least one of the flu vaccines could do something in that regard.
That's kind of an exciting prospect. It's a two for people. Get the flu shot.
Yeah, it's a very interesting area. And in fact, if these trials do show that trained immunity works, it's going to have a big effect on the practice of vaccines for infectious diseases going forward for other pandemics, which we're going to have in the future.
Yes, I think now we all understand it really can happen. Months ago, we thought, oh, in this day and age, with all our science, how can this happen?
No more science fiction. This is for real, and it's with us as a species because there's so many of us on this earth, and so many animals are being forced into proximity with people. Viruses carried in these animals, they're going to mutate and sometimes jump into people. But this is not the end of the whole pandemic story.
So there are three questions that are somewhat related, and it's about coronavirus particles in the air. And in the beginning, people talk about obviously wiping down surfaces, but it seems like the main offender and means of transmission is the inhalation of these small particles, airborne. So A, is that true? And then B, if it is true, how can we feel safe going to our CF clinics for PFTs? I understand people are being spaced out over longer periods of time, but it seems there were those studies that showed the particles stay in the air for up to 3 hours.
Right. So this is something where you need to check in with your CF center. I can tell you what we've done. We've put HEPA filters into each of the rooms where the procedure is being done. And those are very effective at pulling out the particles from the air. In addition, most clinics have good circulation. It's important to know what the circulation, the ventilation of the clinic is, because that does have a bearing on this question. And then there's the time factor. So if you add those up, I think you can come up with a protocol that we think is safe, that allows for PFT testing at the clinic. But there are going to be those variables to check out in terms of their influence on that possibility. Of course, there's also disinfection between patients, so any fomites that is settling is going to be taken care of. So I think all those things can and are being done in most CF clinics now. The other piece of this is that there is this shift towards testing at home using home spirometry, which there's a sort of a email group among CF clinicians where there's been a lot of back and forth about what are you doing, how are you doing that, what are you using, and so forth. So it's still being worked out, but I think there is a shift. It's part of the whole telemedicine impact to do more follow-up with remotely, and that includes PFTs. It can include oximetry we talked about. It can also include cultures where you take culture at home and send it in. So all those things are things that are in play right now, and we're going to see again variability until we have a lot more research and settling on optimal guideline for how to do this right. But I think in general, spirometry is pretty safe if you follow the rules of that I mentioned that we've implemented: time, air filtration, good ventilation, and fomite disinfection.
And you had mentioned before that some clinics are testing patients regularly. Is that standard practice at many CF centers, that when people come for appointments or prior to the appointment they have a test?
We're not doing that routinely, and I think it's going to again be variable. My guess is in most places it's not being done as a routine, but it was interesting that the foundation, email about the COVID situation has reflected the fact that some places are doing it and they don't feel it's helpful to report testing at this point because of implementing this routine screening. It's going to change further as more self-testing becomes available and on the market, whether it's the saliva test or the self-nasal test. I think there will be more and more point-of-care home testing, and that will, again, change how the whole surveillance is being utilized in the CF centers.
And just to finish up on the airborne particles, so people at home, if they have filters, air purifiers at home with the HEPA filters, will that be enough to protect the family?
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that the HEPA filter can pick up viral particles. It's within the range to do that very effectively. The problem is that will work for the tiny aerosolized particles that are staying in the air. But the transmission could occur just from being near another person if they cough or speak, and you get a direct, very quick transmission that's not filtered out of the ambient air. So I don't want to give a false sense of security that if you have a HEPA filter in the room, you don't need the mask, you don't need the distance. No, you need to keep doing those things, but the HEPA filter is going to be a plus on top of that.
Great. Is the virus showing any signs of changing or weakening over time? Our CF clinic mentioned that once a vaccine is out, that the virus could potentially start to adapt and grow stronger. Is this true?
So again, I'm not a virologist, but from what I've read, the coronaviruses are not known for big mutations. And to the extent that they've been studied, we haven't seen that. In the COVID pandemic, the only real shift that's been seen has been the emergence of this one mutation that may infer greater infectivity, but doesn't change severity. So there has yet been no report of a mutation that definitely increases the virulence of the virus. So I think in general, the hope is that this will be one of the easier rather than more difficult viruses to have a good vaccine for, that won't need to be changed every year, for example, like we need to do for flu. But we're still learning, so it's early days. And I do know that tracking the viral genome is something that's being done on a huge scale around the world. So there's a tremendous amount of data being generated. And again, the word that we get from the people that know about this in detail is that they have not seen any real breakout mutations.
It seems that taking people's temperatures is commonplace now. But because so many people are asymptomatic, is this practice giving people a false sense of security?
Well, it's a good first step screening measure. There was a what's called a meta-analysis of hundreds of studies of symptoms from around the world that was done based in the UK, and they found that fever was present in, on a worldwide basis, close to 80% of people who get COVID. So no, it's not 100%. It is going to miss 20, and in some localities it goes way down. I think it was South Korea where only like 35% had fever. So there's going to be variation there, but in general, it's a decent first step. So, for example, if you get off a plane in an airport, you might get your temperature checked, or going into a restaurant, things like this. It's not foolproof, but it's better than doing nothing. So I think it can be helpful as long as people don't consider it foolproof, because it certainly is not foolproof.
Back to COVID-19 tests. It's been a while since we've talked, so have there been any changes? Which COVID-19 tests are the most reliable? Should you only be tested with the presence of symptoms? What does the CDC recommend for quality testing protocol at this point?
Oh boy. So this was one where there was a big political football, because the CDC issued new guidelines that initially seemed to say, don't test asymptomatic people, only test symptomatic people. There was a huge amount of pushback from the scientific medical community on that, and the CDC walked that back. It's not the first time this has happened in this pandemic. Changing advice, and this is one reason why our country is not doing well. We're not getting clear, decisive, and uniform messaging from what have until now been trusted federal sources like the CDC and the FDA. And it's really a tragedy. It's a huge, huge tragedy. And I believe it's contributed greatly to our problem in this country. But I think most people now believe that testing is really still very important, to know how widespread the virus is in the community and to know if you're doing enough. And again, I mentioned at the beginning of our talk, this 5% notion that you should have less than 5% positives to feel that you're on top of the virus. If more than 5% of tested people are positive, it means that things are out of control in that wherever that testing is being done. And it's an arbitrary number, but it's a decent rule of thumb. You want to keep that number very low, is what we're saying. And so I still think that this is the best way to go. The way that the testing is done is certainly expanding, and some self-testing kits or methods that have been shown to be very solid are available. So you can do this by what's called an anterior nasal swab. You don't have to go do that brain biopsy that people complain about, where the thing is pushed all the way back. You can actually get a good sample from the front of the nose if you do it properly. This is for the PCR test. Saliva has also been used. A whole new generation of tests they're based on what's called antigen testing. Rather than testing for the viral genetic material, they're testing for a viral protein. They're not as sensitive as the genetic tests, but they could be more than adequate for screening purposes. And several of these antigen tests look like they're going to be very helpful, but they've not been widely distributed. One problem on the regulatory side is that the FDA has been very generous in allowing, authorizing the use, the so-called emergency use authorizations of tests, so that we have all these, especially in the antibody field, all these different antibody tests that are available. Antibody tests are really more helpful in determining how the disease is penetrated into a particular area. So the so-called seroprevalence tests that can tell you, where you are, where you sit in the pandemic, in a more global sense of early or more widespread penetration of the virus. Even though we have close to 30 million cases worldwide, with the human population of over 7 billion, we're still very early days in terms of the overall history of this pandemic. And it's very hard to wrap your head around that, because the numbers seem so huge. but there are so many more people than there are sick people. It's still a very low percentage of the human population that's been touched directly by the virus, and we have to remember that.
That is, I hadn't thought of it that way, but you are right. But the numbers are so stunning that it's how to balance those two. So these tests that are approved for testing, are there ones available now for people to test in their homes?
That's complicated because it's not really like you get the answer in your home. The home tests often involve collecting it at home and sending it off to a lab. So you still might not get a result for another week, you know? So it's a little more complicated than it seems on face value. What we would really like would be like a dipstick pregnancy test, where you do something at home and then you see within, 15 minutes later. I don't think we're there yet in terms of home testing. Ultimately, that would be a real breakthrough if that was widely available. Maybe we'll have that by the end of the year.
And who is the one that would make like the list of as these things come on the market in terms of effectiveness, the ranking of?
Yeah, the FDA, that would be the FDA, and the FDA does have a website of listed tests of those that they've authorized. Then in terms of vetting them, that kind of gets more diffuse, and a lot of the vetting is being done by academic groups, so they're reporting it in the medical literature, and it's not coming from the government. So we still have a bit of a unregulated situation where you have dozens of different tests that might be out there, but it's hard to know how reliable each one is. So the important thing is if this person's going to use it, that they learn a little bit about the details and what the facts are regarding how well that test is performing. And the company that makes them should be making that available publicly, if nothing else, on their website. And if not, you need to be suspicious about that.
It still amazes me that it's so hard for many people to get tested. I mean, my community, I could say my son, who, not currently, but in the past, felt he had been exposed to somebody once, and another time felt he had symptoms, and both times they're like, nope, don't have enough tests, you don't fit the criteria, which I truly, it's so frustrating. I feel like we really don't know what's going on because we don't have enough tests.
We've never really set up and carried out a national coordinated testing program that would work. So even if you're having a good testing situation in one place, it's such a mobile world that you can go to another state or another locality where it's completely different. And it's really, that's just not how you handle a pandemic, which is everywhere.
I talked to a friend last week who's in Los Angeles. She said, I go once a week and get tested. Like, how does that happen? How does that happen that you have that much access and we can't even get one for every try?
Yeah.
So,
I had a test a couple of weeks ago, sort of just a screening. I got it back within 24 hours, and my son had a test in a very close locality. It took him a week to get the result back, and within the same geographic area.
And my daughter, 10 days.
Yeah.
A lot can happen in 10 days.
It's essentially worthless, either way.
Let's see. We are going to move to vaccines. Lots of questions from people about vaccines. Can you share the current information on the development of vaccines for COVID-19? Which trials are showing likelihood of being ready first, and when do you believe there will be a widespread vaccine available in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a big area with a lot of complexity to it. Part of the issue in the states has been that the federal government has put some chips down. They put some bets on some of these vaccines. So they poured literally billions of dollars into basically helping scale up production for companies that otherwise would want to wait for results. So they can enable the so-called warp speed operation. Basically means that you're scaling up your manufacturing at the same time you're testing whether this is actually going to be usable. So that's a very high risk proposition. That's why the government has stepped in, but it has allowed some of these vaccines to move forward more quickly. Several are in phase 3. one of the ones that people were most enthusiastic about was developed at the University of Oxford, and then they have collaborated with one of the big pharma companies, AstraZeneca, in a phase 3 trial, which was halted the other day because they had what's called a serious adverse event, SAE, in the clinical trials world. And SAE is some serious medical problem where you have to break the blind and find out if that person got the active vaccine or the placebo. This person got the active vaccine and developed a very serious neurological problem, which can result in paralysis. So they halted the trial worldwide from one SAE. This just gives an indication of how problematic this whole thing is. So they have to really take a very serious look at what happened and was it related to the vaccine? The person got the vaccine, but was it related? Very hard to answer that question. If there's any doubt about that, they have to go very slowly or perhaps consider stepping back. And this was one of the lead candidates. So that's not good news to have heard about this whole thing of the AstraZeneca trial. But there are other big companies like Pfizer that are going ahead with trials in the United States, and Moderna. Some of these are with new technologies that have never been used before. And in the midst of all this, we have political pressure to have some kind of miracle before November 4th. So all we can say about that is we need to make sure that the vaccine works and that it's safe. And the only way that people are going to accept that is if they trust the information that comes out and if they trust the results that are stated. So the companies themselves got together, and I think 9 major pharma companies put out a statement about how they were not going to ask for an emergency use authorization of their vaccine unless they felt it was safe and effective, although they left some wiggle room in terms of how they would make that evaluation. So it's all up in the air, and I think as a result, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about this area. I saw a poll, I think just yesterday, where only 42% of the public who answered that poll said they would be willing to get a vaccine as soon as it comes out. And I understand that. I think that's a pretty reasonable hesitancy. And it's on the scientific community as well as the pharmaceutical industry to make sure that people feel that they're getting a real vaccine that's safe and effective. So I don't believe that we're going to have anything available before the election. And I think that even if something does come out that gets an emergency use authorization, almost certainly that's going to go to a particular group of high-risk people, likely to be healthcare workers directly involved in care of people with COVID. We need to know from each trial how many of the at-risk groups are being studied in the trial. You know, how many people with obesity, how many people who are African American, how many people with diabetes or hypertension. And for the CF community, how many people with cystic fibrosis are going to be in these trials? Do we know if CF is going to tolerate the vaccine the same way as other people? Well, we know that's the case for influenza vaccine. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be true for a COVID vaccine. So we still have a lot of questions out there, and I think it's reasonable to be careful in evaluating that. So I personally would hope that we don't see anything out there short of a vaccine that's gone through a complete phase 3 trial, where the results have been fully released and reviewed by peer review. And that is something that's certainly not going to happen in the next 2 months.
I think I read that should they decide to fold that trial, the AstraZeneca Oxford one, that there are already like millions of doses already prepared that would have to be thrown away.
That's right. That's right. That's what this whole warp speed thing is about. Remember, these vaccines will need to be manufactured at least in the hundreds of millions of doses. For example, the Moderna vaccine is a 2-shot vaccine. You need a boost. So it's double the number of vials that have to be manufactured. And the Moderna vaccine needs to be kept at a very cold temperature. So all these hundreds of millions of doses are going to need to find deep refrigeration and that will then have to be delivered to every place that it's targeted for, safely, and kept in this in very cold environment until it's ready to be given. There's a lot, even once you get past the phase 3, uh, bona fides for the vaccine to take care of in terms of distribution, cost, who's going to pay for it. Uh, is this something that if China has a vaccine out, are they going to let us use it? Are we going to let them use our vaccine? The Russians and Chinese both probably will have vaccines available before anything here in the States. And that's because they take different approaches, more higher risk approaches. And they will then be in a worldwide race to reap the benefits of being the people that cured the disease, and so this becomes one of the great political footballs of the common era here.
As opposed to public health and basic morals of humanity. And yes, it does. It makes me nervous because that adverse event, when you already have only 40% of people saying they would have the vaccine early on, it just makes me fear people who are already reluctant. This kind of episode, when you hear paralysis, vaccine, that people will back away from it. It's
well, we've actually been down this road before with the I think it was the swine flu vaccine in 1976. It was under President Gerald Ford. They did rush out a vaccine that caused a certain fairly high number of cases of side effects that also was neurological, nerve damage, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and that had to be withdrawn. So that's the kind of, if that happens here, it's almost incalculable the amount of how disastrous it would be because of the lack of breaking whatever residual trust exists between the general public and the people that are responsible for public health, whether it's the government, the industry, the biomedical community, will all be tarnished by that. So the stakes are just unbelievably high here.
And I will move on from this in just a moment, but with this case then, they drill down, they try and discern, did this person have an underlying issue? Was it a result of the vaccine? How much of that is shared with the public? How much could we expect to know?
Well, it's interesting, the CEO of AstraZeneca made this announcement, and he's been criticized for the fact that they had this information for several weeks before he made it public. And it was made public in a sort of press encounter format rather than any kind of formal scientific manner. It turned out that there was a second case of a woman who developed multiple sclerosis in the trial, but it turned out she had received the placebo, not the active drug. So it clearly wasn't related to the vaccine. Here you have a case, where a very serious event occurred, time-wise connected to the vaccine, possibly. So exploring that further is going to be important. They may need to go back to animal models. They may need to just restart the trial with care. I'm not sure what they're going to do. There's probably a lot of discussion in the AZ boardroom right now about that.
So at this point, what do we know about the long-term effects of COVID-19?
Not much at this point. There was just what I saw was the first follow-up study from people that were very seriously ill with COVID that were in the ICU. And that study actually showed a pretty good outcome for most of those people when they were followed up 6 weeks after discharge from the hospital. So these are survivors of serious disease, severe COVID. Most of them had normal lung function at the time of follow-up, which is very reassuring. Because we've heard in the media about these long haulers who are very sick weeks to months afterwards. And that is very concerning. I think actually what we don't know there is not so much the lung damage, which is so far looks fairly reassuring based on this one small study. There were about 100 people in that study. But the fact that we don't have better information about some of the extrapulmonary effects, particularly on the heart, it's very clear that the heart is a target and blood vessels are a target. So we need to know a lot more and some places are setting up COVID long-term care clinics just to follow people that have recovered or are still recovering to try and gather that information. So in summary, I would say it's a bit early to know. On the one hand, it's clearly that there's a number of people that have long-term effects, and these can range from psychological to neurological, GI, pulmonary, cardiac. We just have to follow these people and see what happens. There is a bit of a precedent from this history of the chronic fatigue syndrome, which has been very difficult to deal with because it's no clear cause has ever been found. Viruses have been implicated from time to time without any one being nailed down. And the changes that occur in the bodies of these people are very subtle in terms of testing. Some very recent work shows that there are some tests that can pick out these folks from people that don't develop chronic fatigue. I suspect that a portion of people with COVID are going to fall into that some kind of chronic fatigue type category, but whether we'll be able to have a predictive test or even a diagnostic test is unclear. I do know that the chronic damage from this is going to be far greater than most people have thought about until now. And just another reason to try and stay safe and not get sick to start with, not get exposed if you can.
With reports of reinfection with COVID-19, is there any new information on the longevity of COVID-19 antibodies? Were these cases separate strains? Were they able to tell people who were reinfected?
Yeah, in some cases, there've only been a few cases reported of reinfection, and it's been both the same and a different strain, if you will, although we don't know if the same virus changed in their body or whether it's really a different source infection. That's been one of the unclear things. It seems that the risk is greater if you are initially have a asymptomatic or a very mild case, because your antibody response is going to be lower than if you had a more severe case. There is this relationship between how much virus you're infected with, the viral load, and the antibody response, as well as the clinical outcome. I think the good news is that from everything we've seen so far, people, by and large, do mount a good antibody response. Most people develop neutralizing antibodies, which means that their antibodies are capable of blocking the virus from getting into the cell. And perhaps just as important, a large number of people also have a good T cell or cellular immune response. And that can also help upon re-exposure. So it looks to me like, although the early antibody response can fade within a few months, you do carry these memory cells that if you get re-exposed, you can then have a very brisk and protective response later on. So the hope is that either with a vaccine or through natural infection, almost everybody is going to be protected from getting sick again, at least for probably up to a year or so. Beyond that, there's really all bets are off. We just don't know at this point.
And in summary, the final question, what else can we do in the CF community to survive the pandemic until we have a vaccine?
Well, I think a big part of this gets back to the education question as well as work. So every person with CF and every family member or caretaker or caregiver needs to look at that individual and see what their situation is and how well they can protect themselves. Because I think this all goes back to prevention until the vaccine is really, the real vaccine is really available. I don't think that's going to be likely for people until next year. So we need to be thinking in terms of the next several months at least, and perhaps longer. And so this is the situation where you need to be cautious and try not to get yourself infected. Don't go to a party. Don't go to a gathering. Make sure you have your mask. Do the old infection control measures that people are used to now, and just continue to do that and exercise a lot of caution, but be reasonable about it. And so I think, If you do get exposed, again, at least according to the European data, 40% of cases are going to be asymptomatic, which is in line with the the general population. And if you do get sick, again, the odds are very good that you're going to survive this thing and get through it. If you have advanced disease, if you have some of these complications like diabetes or a transplant recipient especially, extra caution is necessary to try and stay away and not get yourself exposed. And if you do come down with flu-like symptoms, get yourself tested immediately. Get some Tamiflu if you've got the flu, Tamiflu if you got the flu, and get a flu shot as soon as you can. So there's a lot of things you can do. What you can't do is solve it yourself. This is a social problem. We all are in it together. We really do have to look out for each other, and we have to get through what's going to be a very stormy few months where information is going to be all over the map, and people have to be really careful about what kind of information they act on. I think that's another very important piece of this. Unfortunately, there's so much disinformation, so much conspiracy theory thinking going on about the vaccine, about other aspects of healthcare, some of the drugs, the hydroxychloroquine story, all these things play into a very uncertain atmosphere. So people just have to really have some resilience. And I think the CF centers are a really good source for that information. So most of the people in the community on the caregiver side are really well informed. There's a lot of cohesion, a lot of communication, and I think keeping in good touch with your caregivers is going to be very helpful.
Well, hopefully we can impose on you again to come back and keep us updated, because I have to say, on behalf of the CF community, you've just been a gift to us for sharing your information, the voice of reason, the solid research. It's just been so incredibly helpful for me and for so many people who've been watching these podcasts. So thank you so much for sharing your time.
I'm glad to be of help. Thanks.